Good evening. My name is Olivier Morel, and I'm an associate professor with the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, as well as the Department of Film, Television and Theatre. I would like to express my gratitude to the Nanovic Institute who picked up this beautiful film. I would like also to thank Ricky Herbst and his staff, who's in the booth, for making this screening possible. And I want to thank Jim Collins, who's also teaching a class within the context of this screening. And we'll have a discussion after the film. And I really welcome you to stay. Nous ne nous désolidariserons pas. At War, its French title, En Guerre, is a film by Stéphane Brisé. It's a 1 hour, 45-minute feature film that was entirely shot in 23 days in the months of October and November of 2017. The film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival on May 15 of 2018 and was released in France on the next day. I would not have mentioned this timeline if it had not had a troubling relationship to what had begun to develop in October and November of 2018, 1 year after the shooting of En Guerre. The historical moment that took place in France with an inaugural wave of demonstrations on November 17, 2018, is often described as a populist, grassroots, revolutionary, rebellious political movement for economic justice. This quasi-revolutionary earthquake, in which, according to official sources, the French government nearly fell in December of 2018, this movement is also known as the Mouvement des Ronds-Points, the roundabouts movement. It lasted for many months until spring of 2019, with people demonstrating and rioting every single Saturday across France, but significantly in the most touristic and iconic locations, like for example the Champs-Élysées or La Madeleine in Paris. I cannot begin to explain why this major revolt erupted, not to mention its very unusual magnitude. At the very least, I have to highlight the fact that the trigger was the increase of taxes, and the way this increase of taxes targeted low-income workers and families, while at the same time the French government was lowering the taxes on the wealthiest. I can just identify a few defining features of this roundabouts movement. Number one, they are wearing gilets jaunes, that's the yellow vests, which indicates that they belong to the class of workers, many of them being the working poor class, as we sometimes name them in the US. Number two, these are people who work precarious, difficult jobs, both physically and mentally. Those people run the economy, the industry, and the social system. Number three, they are also the ones who typically very rarely have a voice, even though they wear this highly recognizable yellow vest that signals to everyone that they are doing jobs that expose them to constant danger and hazards. In 2019, this wealthy country of France saw this class of workers who do not make a decent living in order to survive erupt on the world stage. They, the yellow vests, they could very much be identified as the workers depicted in Stéphane Brisé's film At War. Nous ne nous désolidariserons pas. This movement, you might have seen it in the news, was extremely reactive, fast, and fluid. It did not fall into the usual categories of unionized protests or traditional forms of political representation or expression. This fragmentation of unions and the decline of political representation is very accurately rendered in Stéphane Brisé's film. Although this historical event did not erupt out of nowhere, that's the coincidence of dates that I'm highlighting, it caught the government and the institutions by total surprise, and the movement turned out to be extremely difficult to control by the state for many reasons. One remarkable characteristic of the Yellow Vests was the ethnic diversity of the movement, as well as the unprecedented representation of women among its leaders. The movement's fluidity might explain why, unlike other movements of the recent past, we have seen forms of extreme police repression and brutality against the Yellow Vests, with an account of 613 persons injured by the police, 238 having suffered serious head injuries, 23 individuals having lost an eye, and 5 a hand. One person, an elderly woman from the Muslim community, was killed inside her apartment in Marseille in the south of France when a rubber bullet was fired by a police officer who aimed for her head. This police violence was not limited to brutality against demonstrators. It was also directed at journalists, the vast majority of them being clearly identified as members of the press. According to Reporters Without Borders, 90 professionals from the media fell victims to police brutality during this period, with bad injuries in many cases. These acts of violence have been denounced by NGOs like Amnesty International, by professional organizations of journalists, as well as by the United Nations and the European Union. Historians have drawn comparisons to the Flower War, that's the Révolte Frumentaire, right? Some of the pre-revolutionary riots that took place in 1775, about 15 years before the French Revolution. The prominent historian Gérard Noiriel even established a highly convincing comparison between the movement of the Yellow Vests and the Jacquerie of the medieval period, during which popular revolts of peasants protested against nobility, who had forced the peasantry to pay ever-increasing taxes back in 1358. According to Noiriel, this prominent historian, the roundabouts movement and the peasants of the 14th century have something remarkable in common. Something featured, again, in Stéphane Briset's film. Impoverished peasants in the 14th century, farmers in the 18th century, and the workers shown in At War cannot make a living wage despite their hard work, and the response given to them by economic and political leaders, by the courts of justice and other institutions, consists in crushing them. The son of a stay-at-home mom and a mailman, filmmaker Stéphane Briset is influenced by the French literature of the 19th century, a time when novelists and philosophers were passionate about the workplace. Think about Balzac, about Zola, about Hugo, of course. There is a lot of Germinal, for example, by Émile Zola in At War. At the time when he was completing At War, this director, Stéphane Briset, was also working on a stunning adaptation of Une Vie by Guy de Maupassant, the French writer Guy de Maupassant of the late 19th century. I'm sure that those of you who followed the career of the Dardenne brothers, for example, to speak more about cinema, will also think about their 1999 masterpiece Rosetta when you watch At War. In the footsteps of the Dardenne brothers and the Dardenne brothers cinema, Briset follows the tradition of Robert Bresson's work, as well as the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave. An example is the fact that aside from Vincent Lindon, who's the main male actor in the film, who's a really very famous French actor. So Vincent Lindon is playing Laurent Amédéo in the film, but aside from him, none of the actors featured in this film are professionals. They are workers themselves, like the stunning Mélanie in the film, whose real name is also Mélanie Rover. With solid indications from the director, the entire film was shot based on improvisations, which again increases the uncanny feeling that I would like to highlight. Made prior to the Yellow Vests movement, this film is another example that, when it's done well, cinema often serves as a forerunner to history, as a highly visionary artistic form. Nous ne nous désolidariserons pas. That's in the film, of course. Thank you.